powerful people in the United States are frightened of any kind of alternative system which challenges what they see as their God-given right to command the wealth and the power in their society. There was a time when Cuba was no more than a bordello, a casino, for the worst elements of the United States of America. The truth is, your country and mine don't mind dictators at all, as long as they're dictators who obey orders.
Welcome to Voices of Our World, a presentation of this station and Mary Knoll. I'm your host, Eileen Bott. As one of the most outspoken critics of the war in Iraq and the Bush administration, British Parliament member George Galloway has made a name for himself worldwide as someone who never shies away from expressing his point of view. With his new book, The Fidel Castro Handbook, he proves once again that no topic is taboo for his pointed and strident opinions. Join us as we discuss the delicate subject of Cuba, Castro, and the revolution with our guest, George Galloway. This is Voices of Our World. For nearly 50 years, America's relationship with Cuba has hardly been neighborly, despite the fact that this island nation lies a mere 90 miles from our shores. As the tireless Fidel Castro approaches the end of his rule, many are speculating on what will be the future of Cuba. As a close friend of Castro's, George Galloway has had a great deal of behind-the-scenes access to Cuban political affairs, and he shares his insights and thoughts on Cuba's past and its future with our producer, Michael Ramadan Jones, in this interview for Voices of Our World.
Welcome to our program, and you're no stranger to controversy, and your latest work, The Fidel Castro Handbook, is no exception. Is there any particular reason you chose to title this a handbook?
Yes, it's for the general reader that this book has been written. There are many more substantial tomes which are more dense, more packed, and there is a market for them. But I figured that on his 80th birthday, and especially as it's now turned out, on the occasion of very serious illness, which has temporarily at least put him out of office, that there was a bigger market for a work which was more accessible for those who are not already aficionados of the Cuban Revolution and the life and times of Fidel Castro.
What's your personal history with Fidel and the island of Cuba?
Well, I did indeed have access to his personal family album and personal archives on the basis of a friendship going back, more than 20 years now. And I've spent more time with Fidel Castro than anyone else in Britain and almost anyone else from outside of the Latin America area. And I've been very fortunate, privileged indeed to be so. And I had advantage of my personal friendship with him, as well as, of course, a very long record of political solidarity and political relationship.
Well, as you surely know, Fidel can be a sensitive topic for a variety of reasons. Who would you say are his most prominent or vocal opponents, and what are their motives and reasons for their oftentimes hateful rhetoric towards Fidel Castro?
Well, of course, there was a time when Cuba was no more than a bordello, a casino, for the worst elements of the United States of America. The criminal classes, the mafia, anyone who's seen Godfather 2 knows exactly the role that Cuba played in the life of such people. And of course, all that was ended with the triumph of the revolution. The casino owners, the bordello owners, the pimps, the criminals, those who served United States criminal interests in the past were all either driven from or left voluntarily from the island. And they formed what was and has become basically a terrorist colony in Florida, where a small group of dedicated terrorists swims in the water of the Cuban emigre population, at least until this current young generation came along, with impunity and planned their nefarious schemes to bring about the downfall of Fidel, the destruction of the Cuban Revolution, and the return to the island of the casino owners and the bordello owners. People have amassed critical mass, electorally speaking, in at least two states, Florida and New Jersey. And as someone once said, you don't need the hearts and minds if you get them by somewhere else. the hearts and minds will follow. And I think that that's what's happened. This poison has been injected into U.S. national politics by the exigencies of this emigre community and the disinherited of the revolution.
You mentioned in your book, I guess, what could be called the Cuban lobby here in America and their tactics and their political clout. Could you speak a little bit about the origins of the CANF and the monetary clout they wield in American politics?
Well, it's very strange, isn't it, that in a country that's supposed to be leading the war on terror, a large number of terrorists have been harbored for the best part of half a century in one of your country's most important states, in Florida. And many of these people were very rich, have become very rich, and they have purchased influence in both of the political parties. It won't have escaped the notice of the sharp-eyed advisor that when Miss Lewinsky was seeing to President Clinton, he had to take a call from one of the most prominent of the Cuban-American Foundation, whose brother was on equally intimate terms, not equally as intimate as Miss Lewinsky, but equally intimate in the terms of being a fundraiser and a supporter with the Republican Party. These people have influence in both of the main parties in the United States, and it's been a thoroughly malign influence.
This is Voices of Our World. If you're just tuning in, we are speaking with George Galloway about Castro, Cuba, y la revolución. In America, few topics are as volatile as our relationship with Cuba. Simply debating the subject is bound to raise eyebrows and blood pressures. But as the war in Iraq shows us the results of not vigorously debating our foreign policy, it is clear that silence can have its consequences. We continue our interview with George Galloway on Voices of Our World.
This brings us, I guess, to the issue of who Fidel has fought for and still fights for. Would you say that his support is largely from the Third World?
Well, I think if Fidel Castro came to any capital city in the world, anywhere, he would draw a crowd of hundreds of thousands where it was not millions. If President George W. Bush came to any capital in the world today, the first thing is that the host government would be kicking themselves that he had decided to visit. And secondly, not only would he not draw a crowd, he'd have to be guarded by a very substantial crowd of security men. That's a measure of the relative popularity across the whole world of these two leaders. And of course, President Bush is just the 10th of the presidents who have tried to see Fidel Castro off. But of course, the liberation of Cuba and the path which it has blazed is more relevant to poor countries of the South than it is to wealthy, developed countries of the North, though I actually think there's much that even wealthy northern countries can learn. But there is no doubt that the example of the Cuban Revolution, of slaying the idea that that cash is king, that the dollar rules or the pound rules, and that there is another way that you can organize your society, which can actually work for the benefit of the great majority of the people of the country, is very clear. And that's why we can say that whatever happens in the next few months, Fidel Castro will in that sense never die, because his reputation, his inspiration, the path that he has blazed is already being followed in Latin America in particular by country after country. You could not win an election in Latin America now unless you were going to cheat like they did in Mexico and Peru, unless you said you were a friend of Fidel Castro and an opponent of George Bush. And of course it's remarkable, and I hope it emerges from the book, that Fidel Castro was born to a life of relative privilege. He could have enjoyed life as a latifundist, as a big landowner, as a person of wealth and position in the old society. But that was not for him or for his brothers and sisters, for that matter. And for that we must thank his mother and father, who infused the family with a higher sense of morality. The basic principle was patriotism, the feeling that having thrown off the yoke of Spanish colonialism, the country had, by one means or another, been delivered into tutelage to the big neighbor just 90 miles away to the north. And this was not any kind of independence, was the basic calculation that the Castro family made, that a country could not be truly independent whilst it was economically and politically under the influence of a big neighbor who wished to reduce it to the kind of status that I described earlier, a service colony to service the more base instincts of the worst elements of the big neighbor. And so Fidel's impulse in the beginning was, as Martí before him, to free his country from the domination of a more powerful country. That's the way it would have continued, I think. Though it would have been a radical nationalist revolution, it would have been a radical nationalist revolution. Fidel Castro was pushed into an alliance with the Soviet Union and the socialist countries by the ill-judged policies of one United States president after another. And that kind of self-critical look at the story in my book is, I hope, the one that most United States readers will deploy.
You put your finger on something I find rather important, and that's that in the past, America has never had trouble dealing with and perhaps even supporting and propping up foreign governments that didn't share our beliefs or that we even dislike. And as long as they have something we want, we have no problems with that. So given the richness of Cuban culture and resources, why have we been so close to relations with Cuba? And is it inappropriate to suggest that there's maybe a racial component as well as a political one?
Well, partly that, I think. And you'll note that the United States is not actually seeking many more immigrants from Cuba now because of the racial background that most of the recent immigrants share. But I think as time went on and Cuban independence became a real thing, and Cuban achievements under that independence became, well, frankly, staggering. I mean, I don't know if your listeners know, but a child born in Cuba today has a smaller risk of dying in infancy than a child in Washington, D.C., in the richest country in the world. A Cuban born today will live longer than an American citizen born in Washington, D.C. And this in a poor country, which has been 45 or more years under quarantine and siege and subject to subversion and terrorism and even invasion. This is an extraordinary achievement. And the more extraordinary the achievement, the more the threat of a good example to other poor countries, particularly Latin American countries, whom it has been an article of faith of successive U.S. presidents to believe that Latin America was their backyard, to use that insulting term. Well, nobody wants to be anyone's backyard. The backyard is where you keep the trash. People want their country to be their own front yard. And as Cuba became more and more successful and its achievements became more and more famous, then the threat that Cuba represented to the United States, the threat of a good example, became more and more important and therefore more and more necessary to try to extinguish.
Now, Senator, I gave my heart and soul to oppose the policy that you promoted. I gave my political life's blood to try to stop the mass killing of Iraqis by the sanctions on Iraq. Senator, in everything I said about Iraq, I turned out to be right and you turned out to be wrong. And 100,000 people have paid with their lives. Senator, you are trying to divert attention from the crimes that you supported. Have a look at the real oil for food scandal.
Join us as we speak with the sometimes provocative and always interesting George Galloway about Cuba, Fidel, and El Futuro of the Revolution. Today on Voices of Our World.
I guess Fidel has been associated with two isms that strike fear in the hearts of many Americans, and that would be socialism and communism. Why do you think these forms of governments have been so feared by the West? What do you think we're actually afraid of?
Well, of course, there was a time when socialism was not a dirty word in the United States, when people could run for president as a socialist and garner millions of votes. There was a time in the United States when capitalism so catastrophically failed that people were in large numbers looking for an alternative system of society. But I'll grant you, since the Cold War, at least until another ism came along, the Islamism with which your country is gripped in war today, I think the powerful people in the United States who own and control its economy, who own and control its means of communication, its mass media, and who own and control the political process thereby, are frightened of any kind of alternative system which challenges what they see as their God-given right to command the great majority of the wealth and the power in their society. Now, capitalism has failed huge numbers of people in the United States. An even bigger number live on the edge under the capitalist system. They get by, but they have to work all the hours that God sends, and they live lives of insecurity in case they lose the position they have in life. And the small number of people who live the life of Riley under the capitalist society in the United States are always anxious, always insecure, and therefore have to try and strike down, extinguish, crush underfoot anyone, anything which provides any kind of alternative.
Recently, much has been made of communist China and its emergence in this globalized economy. How has their role as a new superpower affected Cuba? And do you see any potential conflicts in the years to come as China and Cuba become closer?
Well, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the disappearance virtually overnight of the satellite countries of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost well over 80% of its trade at a stroke. And then followed some very dark years, I mean literally dark, where no lights were on the streets, where there was no petrol for the vehicles, the kind of special period that Cuba passed through. But she's now seeing much brighter days with much higher rates of economic growth, 14% last year, than almost any country in the world. By the grace of God, Cuba has discovered oil. And has discovered new allies in the Hugo Chavez government in Venezuela, the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia, the new governments in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Argentina, to a lesser extent in Chile. Now there is emerging a block of countries who are sharing resources. I was just in Venezuela just a week or so ago, and in every poor barrio, in some of the worst slums I've ever seen around the capital city, there are now tens, scores of Cuban doctors ministering to the poor population there who've never had a health service before. The top quality service that the Cuban health service can provide, all entirely free from the cradle to the grave. This is having an impact not just on the health of the people, but of course on the whole level of consciousness of the people who see that cooperation between two Latin American countries, where Venezuela gives some things and Cuba gives teachers and doctors to Venezuela, and this is beginning to spread now throughout Latin America and indeed further afield. This has raised Cuban prestige to the highest possible levels.
You mentioned all the positive things, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to address the accusations and criticisms that Cuba constantly receives about violating human rights, censoring its press, etc.
Well, it's true that Cuba doesn't have the same kind of elections that they have in, say, Florida under Governor Jeb Bush. It's true that they don't have presidential elections like the one you had a couple of years ago between Tweedledee and Tweedledum, where each candidate had to raise $1 billion in order to fight an election, which was probably stolen in the state of Ohio. It's true that that kind of democracy doesn't exist in Cuba. But democracy is about outcome as much as it's about process. And the democracy of the outcome of production and life in Cuba is clear for any visitor to see. The Prime Minister of Cuba drives himself to work every day in a beat-up Lada, Russian Lada car, picking up hitchhikers and dropping them off on the way. Now, that's a kind of democracy. And, of course, it would be entirely wrong to imagine that there's no political debate in Cuba. In fact, the whole island is a throbbing ferment of political debate, meetings, conferences, arguments, all over the country, all the time, to thrash out the best way forward on this issue or that. Now, it's true that people who support the return to Cuba of the emigre owners of the bordellos and the casinos, those who wish to bring back a system where all the schools and clinics and hospitals will be turned back into hotels and casinos and gambling dens of all kinds. They're not welcome in Cuba, and they're not free to proselytize for that return. And that's mainly because Cuba is under siege, and siege under international law is an act of war.
If you're just joining us, this is Voices of Our World, and we're speaking with Parliament member George Galloway about Castro's Cuba and its complex relationship with America. The U.S. and Cuba have been in a staring contest for nearly 50 years, and no one has yet to blink. Meanwhile, families and individuals in both countries continue to suffer as this needless stalemate enters its fifth decade, with no end in sight. We conclude our interview with George Galloway on Voices of Our World.
I'm going to ask you about the future of Cuba in a moment, but first I'd like to ask you about the commercialization of Fidel and the revolution in general. It reminds me a lot, as a kid growing up in America, black kids were wearing Malcolm X t-shirts for about 4 or 5 years as part of a trend, but they weren't necessarily interested in his message. And now today I see the same thing happening with Fidel. How do you feel about the commercialization of his image, and do you think it damages the revolution?
I tell a story in my book, and there's some beautiful pictures to illustrate it, of the day that I was sitting with Fidel in his office when, jogging along the road on CNN, was President Clinton wearing a Malcolm X baseball cap. And Fidel had to double, triple take, and then he launched into a discussion which led by him saying, if you'd told me 40 years ago that the President of the United States would be out running in a Malcolm X baseball cap, I'd never have believed you. I take a not purist approach to this, I must tell you. I think the image of Che Guevara, which is ubiquitous everywhere, on every demonstration, in every revolution, in every poor area, wherever there is a spirit of rebellion and protest, the image of Che Guevara is emblazoned. Now, some of the people wearing the image will not understand all the twists and turns of Che Guevara's life, but they're not wearing it for that. They're wearing it to symbolize, I am a rebel. And a rebel is a good thing to be in this world.
My last question actually is about the next 10 years for Cuba. We here in America, often if you see our press, seems like we're eagerly awaiting Fidel's demise. What do you think will happen, let's say, in the next 10 years? Will Raul take over? Will our policy change at all towards the island?
Well, in a way, the transition has already taken place, and without much disruption at all. Although Fidel is slightly better now, in effect, the country has moved with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Speaker of the National Assembly, and others, effectively being a collective leadership for the country. And I think that's what will happen.
There's a quote on page 356 of your book, and I'd like to read it quickly and just ask you one quick question about Iraq. The quote is, how can you talk about democracy to a child abandoned in the street? How can you talk about democracy with a hungry person, an illiterate person, an unemployed person, or one who has nothing, one to whom no one pays any respect or attention, who people with money treat like a dog? What democracy can exist in a society of exploiters and exploited? Briefly, what is your current assessment of what's happening in Iraq right now, given that we're trying to spread democracy there? And I would love to hear, given your history with the U.S. government and the Congress in particular, what your current assessment may be.
Well, of course, no one seriously believes that we invaded and occupied Iraq in order to introduce democracy. After all, in the country next door, Saudi Arabia, which is the unfreest country on the earth, the British and American governments are the regime's closest friends and are arming it to the teeth in order to crush liberty and democracy. This day, the security forces of Colonel Gaddafi of Libya are being trained, courtesy of the taxpayer of the United Kingdom, by the British government. But Colonel Gaddafi didn't become a Democrat. His forces are being trained in order to crush democracy and liberty in his country. The truth is, your country and mine don't mind dictators at all, as long as they're dictators who obey orders. The only dictators we object to are those who no longer obey our orders and who refuse to rule their country in our interests rather than the interests of their own people. The democracy in Iraq that has been paid for in the life's blood of thousands of your soldiers and mine, and hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million maybe, Iraqis, is of course utterly hollow. because that quote that you just gave there might well have been given in the context of Iraq. What's democracy to an Iraq which is atomized into 1,000 pieces, whose back has been broken, where sectarian militias roam and murder at will, where billions and billions of dollars are stolen by personnel of the United States, personnel of the puppet regime, leaders of these militias who are, if you can picture it, like the gangs of New York. That's the kind of people that we have put in power in Baghdad. And so if you walk down any street in Iraq now and you were able to reach the people cowering within their houses, not knowing if they'd be alive or dead 5 minutes hence, and said you'd come in the name of democracy, they wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for being on the show today. We're talking with George Galloway, and the book is The Fidel Castro Handbook. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.